Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today. Oh, we're a little loud. And I want to thank all of you for coming as well. Elizabeth is here with me, and our daughter Leslie. Where is Leslie? Right here, sitting by her mother. Tell you an interesting story about Elizabeth. Elizabeth's father, Bill Grimes, was an attorney in Palmetto, Florida, in Bradenton, Florida. And show you how small the world is, you learn as you get older it is. Her father debated my father in 1941 in Atlanta. He was debating for the University of Florida Law School and my father for the University of Alabama Law School. And they got to know each other. And Elizabeth and I were married 6 years later. I've always thought that was very interesting. But thank you all for coming. I'm honored that you would be here today to share this time with us. And let me discuss my father and his life and his journey. And let me, at the outset, say that I didn't intend to write a book. I started writing a few years ago, very early in the morning, as Elizabeth could attest, too early some mornings, about my life and my father's life and about people and events and perceptions. And the more I wrote, the more I realized there was a man here in my father that many people never knew. I realized that he was defined early on in his career by segregation. I certainly understand that, and I have chronicled that in the book. But there was so much more to his life than that I wanted to share with others. And I'm very grateful for the reception the writing has received around the state. Let me just start off by giving you a little bit of history on my father's life. I know you know some of it, but my father was born in 1919, and he was part of the rural Depression South, the part of the nation Franklin Roosevelt called our nation's number one economic problem, because we were rural and agricultural. We didn't have the industrial base the North had to mitigate somewhat the damage of the Great Depression. So he saw poverty, dire poverty, among blacks and whites in the South. And he traveled with his grandfather, who was a very prominent doctor in Barber County. And he went as they made house calls. And he would see his grandfather boil morphine in a spoon to give a shot to a dying cancer patient. So he saw this poverty among blacks and whites as his grandfather made the rounds. And that had a deep impression on my father in terms of the suffering of the people of the South. Growing up as a child in Barber County, he became very attuned to the South and the great Southland and the goodness and decency and the faith of our people in the South. And that stayed with him. It's often said, I've heard stories from his brother Jack told me over the years that when my father was about 5 years old or so and he'd see a stranger in Clio, he'd walk up to the stranger and he'd stretch out his hand and say, "I'm George Wallace. If I can help you, let me know," as a 5-year-old. Because he would hear his grandfather and father say the same thing. And he would ask his mother to buy something in Clio made in Alabama. He said, "Mama, that'll help us in Alabama if you buy it in Alabama." In addition, he heard his father and grandfather talk about the need for, as they called it at the time, technical training. At that time, the only youngsters who could attend the post-secondary level institution generally were from affluent families. Not always, exceptions to that, but generally. There was no choice or chance for the average rural child to attend a post-secondary level institution. So that's where the 2-year schools, that was the genesis of his hearing his father and grandfather talk about the need for technical training. So when he was elected to the legislature after the war, he introduced this, and he had a fight on his hand, but he, I think, first established 5 or 6 and then completed those when he was governor. And I heard a story earlier today from a lady that said they helped me prepare to go to college. But as the curriculum and the discipline has changed in the 2-year schools, they've advanced to technology and nursing and other disciplines, and they've been as described as a string of pearls around the neck of our great lady, the state of Alabama. And I'm very proud of the 2-year schools, as was he. But that's what those were his roots. Rural South Alabama, and it had a deep impression upon me. He went to university, and he actually met my mother there. He had just graduated from law school, and he was driving a dump truck preparing to go to the war. And Mother was 16 years old working at Kresge's dime store, and so he met her there. And they were married 7 months later, and then he went off to war. When he came back, he was elected to the legislature, and he was also elected as circuit judge. They say he hit the ground running when he got back. Actually, there's stories about him sending Christmas cards when he was on the island of Tinian, flying night missions over Japan, back home. So he was preparing to run when he got home. And he did. And they say he knew everybody in Barber County and in that district, even the chicken thieves. They said he knew them all. So then he was elected circuit judge. And, in terms of how he's in his early career defined, I have some writing in the book from J.L. Chestnut, who's passed away now, but my friend from Selma, black civil rights attorney, and Fred Gray, who say that as a circuit judge, he was the most fair judge in the state to them. And that speaks volumes of his sense of justice. There was one case J.L. Chestnut and his clients had in my father's court against some large landowners. And they were represented by some big-time attorneys from Birmingham. And these attorneys would refer to Mr. Chestnut and his clients, who happened to be black, as those people. And my father called those attorneys from Birmingham to the bench, and he said, if you don't refer to them as Mr. Chestnut and his clients, I will put you in jail for contempt. Do you understand me? So my father's early life gave him a sense of the suffering of all of our people and the need to be fair with everyone. And that was the position he took in 1958 when he ran for governor. He was the moderate on the issue of segregation. He was quoted in 1958 as saying, if I can't treat a black man fair, I don't deserve to be your governor. Now, folks, as you move forward, that was the issue at the time on people's minds. And I want to take you back in time and realize my father was born in 1919. We're going on 100 years. It was a different era, a different time. People thought differently. But John Patterson said after the 58 race, he said, I talked about roads, I talked about economic development, I talked about education, I talked about quality of life issues, and they just sat there. He said, when I talked about segregation, they stomped the floor. Okay? That was the issue on people's minds. So when my father ran again in 1962, that was the issue he seized because he was ambitious. In many respects, he made a bargain on that issue. And in some respects, I think that went against everything he was feeling inside. But let me say this about that. Having been born in 1919, he was taught as a child, as were his parents and their parents, that segregation was in the best interest of both races. That's what they were taught. They believed that. Dad told Joe Reed not long before he died, he said, Joe, I believed that at one time. But as time passed, the gleaning of wisdom with the passing of time, my conscience tells me that was wrong. And so at that point, there was a point in his life in 1979 when he just left office. There was no immediate political design in his going to Dr. King's church on Dexter Avenue. But he did one night unannounced. And this is a scene that Gary Sinise portrayed in the movie on my father, but in 1997, the 3-hour TNT 2-night special. And my father told the congregation that he had been wrong and that he had suffered because of the gunshot wounds. And he'd come to understand the suffering of others in a way he'd never had before. And he said, if words I've uttered or actions I have taken have harmed others, then I deeply regret that, and I hope you'll forgive me. So there was a bond formed right there between those he'd been accused of harming and because of their suffering and his own suffering. And I think truly that's a wonderful story. That's the essence of my writing, was his entire journey. There's always been a part of me, and I've gotten away from my notes, I hope you'll let me ramble a little bit, but that's always been concerned about the fact that he's only defined by those black and white images of him in segregation. That's part of it. That was part of what really his journey was, a journey we all took, wasn't it? We took it in Alabama, we took it in the South, we took it in the region. So if he was a leader in the Old South, he was a leader in the New South when he worked to bring us all together through reconciliation and understanding, forgiveness, and brotherhood. He truly was. And as I think about some of the racial divide we feel today in our country, and there's some, I think his example is a great example of what we should do to improve relations between people and races. It's as much as I've written a matter of the heart as it is of the mind. and he got it right, and I'm proud that he did. He was elected in 1962. Let me read a quick excerpt from you, the book relative to this. Page. Let me see. I've named this Bob Dylan Talks with George Wallace. An interesting example of the two worlds in which I lived contains itself in Bob Dylan's album Highway 61 Revisited. In listening to Dylan's words and realizing he was talking about my father and the times they are changing was an interesting experience for me. What made it even more interesting is that I played that song for my father one night as he sat on the side of my bed. He would often come in my room and ask about school and things, and then ask me to play something on the guitar, as he would lean his head back and smoke his cigar. He especially enjoyed Hank Williams songs, and I often would play those while my mother and father waltzed to I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, or other Hank songs. This one night he was by himself, and he asked me to play. I had just learned Bob Dylan's The Times They Are Changing, and I started to play it for him. As a 14-year-old, I was singing to him lines such as, "Come senators and congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he that gets hurt will be he who is stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging." I remember him turning to me with a startled look in his eyes. And after hearing only the Hank Williams songs about loving and losing when he came into my room, he was now hearing a song from his 14-year-old son about social conscience and social change. Change that found him as a major player in the midst of the cultural transformation of which he was considered to be the very embodiment of opposition. What was he thinking when I got to the part of the song that said, "Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall"? And he realized the lyrics were talking about him. He got a faraway look in his eyes. And perhaps he was thinking of positions he had taken to be elected governor. Perhaps he was thinking of the bargain he had made in order to be elected governor concerning the issue of segregation. Was he thinking about how, as a circuit judge and son of Alabama, he had worked to enhance the quality of life for all people, black and white? Was he thinking about his public pledge in 1958 race for governor when he said, "If I can't treat a black man fair, I don't deserve to be your governor"? Was he thinking about how he was perceived by so many across the nation as one who had hate in his heart and was a racist? This was a hurt he would have to live with and endure until the day he died. I thought I saw the look of regret in his eyes, and while I saw it for only an instant, he knew I had seen it. Was he thinking about where life's journey had taken him and how the song being sung to him by his son brought that home to him? It was an interesting moment hearing the premier protest song of the 1960s that referred to him as the bad guy, sung to him by his son. It was sung to him by a son not intending to point out that his father was the villain, but sung only because it was a song from his son's generation. As I reflect on it now, the rest of Dylan's lyrics in the verse I sang to my father say, "For he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging." My father would eventually be hurt because of the controversy he had caused when he did stall. He understood the arc of history and where the winds were blowing, but how could he have known his path was taking him to a headwind that would change his life so drastically? Let me talk to you very briefly about Mother. So many people mention Mother as I travel. Elizabeth and I hear the most wonderful stories, endearing stories about her. And it's only at my age now, I turned 60 in October, that I realized for her to leave us at age 41, how young she was, Miriam. She was 41 years old. But she was a wonderful governor, and she had her own charisma, and people developed their own affection and affinity for her. I think they saw the best of our state reflected in her, and they made a great team. He had his own charisma, and she had her own charisma, and there was great affection for her. But I must say that after she was elected, she had a lot of fun with him. There's one story that I had a bit confused. My brother-in-law, Jim Parsons, straightened me out on it, but the first work day after she was inaugurated governor, let me preface this by saying my father always had a habit of riding in the back seat on the right side of the car. Mike, you know that. He had that cigar and that ashtray there, didn't he? That's probably the reason he rode there. But anyway, the first work day after she was inaugurated as governor, she came down a bit early, and she got in the back seat in the right side of the car where he normally sat. No, he came down a bit early. Excuse me, I'm even more confused than I thought I was. He came down a bit early, and he got in where he normally rode. Well, she came down a minute later, and she stood there and said, "George, you'll need to move. I'm going to sit there." And he looked up at her, and he said, "Well, honey, just go in and sit over here, and we got to get to the office." And she stood there. She said it again. Said, "George, you need to move. I'm going to sit there." He said, "Well, honey, let's get in. We need to go. We need to go." And Lloyd Jemison is holding the door. And you need to know Lloyd, as some of you did in this room, he was big as a bear and strong as a bear. And so Mother told Dad, "George, the National Transportation Safety Board has indicated that the safest place to ride is in the back seat on the right side of the car. And I'm the governor. That's where I'm going to ride." And so he said for the third time, "Honey, get in the car." Mother turned to Lloyd, who's big as a bear and strong as a bear, and said, "Lloyd, there's a man in my seat." And he moved over, and she let him have his cherished seat the next day. But one interesting story, amusing story, was a story from our dear friend Oscar Harper I'd like to read to you. There was a trip my mother made to be with my father while he campaigned in California. This was during her time as governor. And Oscar writes, as Oscar told the story, "She took a few days off and joined us in California. It was her only chance to see George. We were all talking up a storm when George remembered he didn't have any clean socks. 'Lorleen, honey, would you mind washing me out a pair of socks?' George asked her. She headed to the bathroom to wash his socks, but I said," that's Oscar, "Wait a minute. You're the governor. You shouldn't be washing socks. He should be washing your hose. I wouldn't be washing his socks. Let him buy some or send them to the laundry." Oscar tells how my father was taken back and afraid for a minute Mother was going to give him one of those stares, which she could do, and hand him her hose. But she just stood there a second and then broke out laughing and washed his socks. As she walked away, my father turned to Oscar and said, "Oscar, don't you go setting Lurleen off. We've got enough to do running for president without you getting her mad." But she touched the hearts of our people, and I'm so proud of the fact that over time she developed a self-assurance about herself as she developed as a candidate and a speaker. She normally started out with a prepared text, but as time passed and she developed a comfort in front of people, her own personality came forward, and people saw that, and they responded to her in a wonderful way. There's one more story I'll tell you that occurred in Robertsdale. This was after she'd become a bit comfortable speaking, and she would normally give her 10-minute speak, and then it was Dad's time to speak and give him the fire and brimstone. Well, he felt as though he was sitting beside her as she was speaking, that she'd spoken long enough, and it was time for him to get up and speak. So he tugged on her skirt, just inconspicuously tugged on it. And she ignored him. And then a minute later, he tugged on it again. She ignored him again. And then the third time, he tugged a little bit harder, and she stopped in her speech and turned to him and said, "George, when I'm finished, I'll let you know." And so they were really like a comedy team around the family. I mean, it was great. It was unbelievable the way it worked out. But she was so young when she left us, and I realize that now. And but I'm so proud of her for her efforts in so many areas, not the least of which is mental health. Because her visiting Bryson Partlow during her term as governor raised the consciousness of the people of Alabama about the need to enhance the quality of care and the facilities themselves for mental health, and I'm very proud of that. Beyond my father being governor, as you know, he ran for president. In 1968, he was a candidate as the American Independent Party candidate for president, and he received 10 million votes. In November of 1968, 14% of the votes. And he would have received, at one point he was at 24% in the polls, but the famous General Curtis LeMay miscue, caused him to drop 10 points in the poll in the next few days. Now, explain what happened. They were to introduce General LeMay in 1968 in Philadelphia to the national media. And before the introduction, my father sat down with General LeMay for 2 weeks, just consistently, and said, "Now, General, you've been a general, and you're used to giving orders, and those orders would be obeyed. Now, we're fixing to go out in front of a bunch of hungry media wolves, and they're going to try to get you into a hypothetical discussion about the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Now, they're going to ask you a hypothetical question such as, if the United States of America would be obliterated if we did not use nuclear weapons, what would you do?" Well, my father told him, he said, "General, of course, I'd use them, you'd use them, any reasonable person would use them to save the United States." But that's not what you say. You say that'll never happen or come up because we'll be so strong conventionally under President Wallace that won't be necessary. That's what you say. You say that in the next question. If they come at you again, say the same thing and move on. Well, he was asked that question. They were ready for him. He asked him, and he got into a hypothetical discussion with him. He said, "I would use a rusty knife or nuclear weapons, whatever it took." At that point, my father stepped in front of him and said, "Wait a minute. He didn't say we're going to use nuclear weapons." Well, he had. And the next day, it was "Bombs Away LeMay," headlines. They disparaged him. You see, and so he went from 24% in the polls, my father did, to 14%. 2% more in 2 states in 1968, and it would have been thrown in the House of Representatives. Without that miscue, it would have been thrown. Jimmy Raine of Yellowwood was traveling with the campaign at the time. We all know Jimmy Raine here. He was in the car with the Secret Service as they took my dad to the airport the next day. And Jimmy says Dad was sitting in the back, and the window was up, but Dad was smoking his cigar, and he was blowing smoke into the window, and it was coming back at him. And he heard my dad mumble, "I should have known a general wouldn't take orders from a sergeant." My father was a sergeant in the Pacific, flying night missions over Japan, and General LeMay was the commander. And his strategy, General LeMay's strategy, in the Pacific, in the air war over Japan, helped win that. So that tended to get by the national media, but he was a great patriot. And I've always found it a shame how he was disparaged. That was a political miscue on his part. He was not within his element. General LeMay wasn't. 1972 was an interesting year. My father ran as a Democrat, conservative Democrat, and was leading in popular votes when he was shot in Maryland in 1972, May 15th. 1 million popular votes ahead and several hundred delegates when he was taken out of the race. There was no way to stop him. There was a sense we felt as we traveled that big momentum is on our side. And he was stopped the only way he could have been stopped. Let me read to you. He always had a sense as well that he might be injured. He told us later that he always felt as though it would be a wound to the head, and he would die from that. He said, "I never anticipated being shot 5 times and paralyzed from the waist down and in constant chronic pain till the day he died." He used to tell me on more occasions than my memory will serve, "If I could simply be paralyzed, son, and not hurt, I'd be the happiest man in the world." But the constant chronic pain from the nerve-ending damage from the bullets caused that pain. And frankly, out of that pain and his suffering day to day, allowed him an understanding of the suffering of others in a way I'll never know. He saw very clearly what I barely have a glimpse of seeing, and felt very deeply what I can barely fathom. And that made him a better person in many respects. The bullets took a lot from him, but they also gave him something as well. But let me read an excerpt from the book about the day he was shot. My father understood the real possibility, very real possibility, that he might be shot. He always believed that if he was shot, he would suffer a head wound and probably die from that. I do not think he ever thought about the possibility of being wounded and becoming a paraplegic until the day he died. When the bullets pierced his body and he fell to the pavement, his life passed before him. He told us later that he realized what had happened and how serious his wounds were. When he hit the ground, he turned his head to the left and kept his eyes closed for about 20 seconds, so as he told us later, to lead a possible second gunman to believe he was dead. His presence of mind kept him from going into shock, and according to his medical team at Holy Cross Hospital, probably saved his life. As the scene around him became more chaotic, he told me of a peace and certain finality he felt. A Secret Service agent was kneeling over him and happened to have his gun that was drawn pointing at my father's head. My father reached up and pushed the gun to the side and told the agent, "I wish you wouldn't point that at me. I've been shot enough for one day." What presence of mind he had. The Laurel, Maryland shopping center was a scene that found not only my father as a gunshot victim, but several other people in the shopping center injured as well. He goes on. Several other paragraphs. The last paragraph. As they started at the hospital, and as my father lay on his back, he could see the tops of trees from the windows in the ambulance, and he described the feeling he had at this time as peaceful and serene, as he thought he might now die. In looking at the treetops, he thought about how he and his brothers Jack and Gerald had climbed trees as children in Clough, and these would be the last trees he would ever see. About that time, as he put it, the pain set in. He described being shot similar to being cut deeply with a razor blade. Initially, there is no sensation, but as the nerve endings begin to react to the penetration, the pain becomes unbearable. That was the time he started asking repeatedly for a pain shot. He said at one time, "I don't mind dying, just don't let me hurt like this." That pain would become his constant companion and bring him many lessons in life. The physical challenges his injury caused at that moment ultimately led him on a spiritual journey that would continue until the day he died. In thinking about his efforts also on the national scene, I'm very proud of the fact that many national columnists and authors have written over time. Dan Carter, a prominent eminent scholar from Emory, George Will, David Broder, Paul Greenberg, and others, that in many respects he was the grandfather of the modern conservative movement prior to Ronald Reagan in our nation. And he was. I believe that. And I'm proud of the fact that he was successful in these national efforts. For example, in 1972, he carried every county in the state of Michigan. In 1972, he carried every county in the state of Florida. Now, some of the national pundits said, well, he'll do all right in the panhandle of Florida. That's redneck country is what they call it. He carried every county, including Dade County in Miami. But he was successful, in my view, because he was taking the value system and the principles of those of the people from whence he came, in the great state of Alabama. And I'll tell you folks this, it's been my unique honor to travel across the country. And I hope you know today that the people of the South give the people of this nation hope because of our faith and patriotism and the goodness of the people of the South. I don't mean to sound too provincial today, but that's the truth, and I want you to know that. One of the things that I think about his last race for governor was very special to him because he won largely because of the large percentage of black votes he received. And I'm very proud of that. When I think about his entire journey, from his early days to the end of his life, I think about the fact that, again, it was a journey we all took. And what I have written is not revisionist. I've tried to convey the entire story. To give you an example of how that's happening, after Gary Sinise portrayed my father in the TNT special, and by the way, my stepmother in that movie was Angelina Jolie. I just thought I'd share that with you. But after that movie, there was a national poll on the internet, and some 85% of the people polled said that they had a completely different view of Governor Wallace now. They knew nothing about his entire life. Only the early video, black and white, about segregation. So that's what I attempted to do, was talk about his entire life. In thinking about that, and I'm going to close, I've got a few pictures I want to show you. I used to visit with him late at night, over the years at night, and say late, and I'd type him scripture on his computer screen on his bed, and we would visit. And he used to tell me, son, I used to believe that politics is the most important thing in my life, in the world. And it was at one time to him, I think. And he said, clearly it's a way to help people, enhance the quality of lives, and help our state progress. But it's really your relationship with the Lord that really matters. I found some letters years ago in our family archives, not intended for the public domain, where he had written Arthur Bremer, the man who shot him 5 times and left him in such constant chronic pain. And in the letters, he told Arthur Bremer that he loved him and had forgiven him. And he told Arthur Bremer, if you'll ask Jesus Christ into your heart, you and I will be together in heaven. And I found those letters, and I read them, and I visited with him one night, and I asked him about it. Because, frankly, there was a part of me that wanted to spend a little time with Arthur Bremer over the years, but it wasn't to discuss the New Testament, it was to discuss the Old Testament. But when I asked him about it, he didn't hesitate, folks. It was as clear and pristine as anything I've ever heard. He said, oh, son, if I can't forgive him, the Lord won't forgive me. It was that clear to him. He got it right. He got it right. That was his greatest victory. The greatest lesson I ever learned from him about faith and forgiveness. He asked me one night, he said, do you know what the most important moment in my life will be, son? I said, no, Dad, when will that be? He said, when my heart stops beating, because then I'll be with the Lord and your mother. I'd never heard it put that way. I thought it was a wonderful way to put it. Let me show a few photographs. Let me mention also that we have in the book 333 photographs. I went through hundreds or maybe thousands of photographs, and I could have, we have several coffee table books in the future maybe of photographs, but this is a picture that was made, I think, in 1966. I'm about to travel, there's a plane behind us about to travel with him somewhere, and I didn't know what picture was going to go on the front of the book. Elizabeth said that picture was going on the front of the book, and I said, yes, ma'am. So that's the picture that we have. This is a picture of Dad's inaugural in January of 1963. My sister Peggy, Bobby, and Mother. Mother must have been 35 there. And that's me with the big ears, and my dad. This is actually Aunt Betty Jean, my Uncle Jack's wife. This is a picture of Dad and Mother in Montgomery walking. I hadn't seen one of them walking, and they were both young and healthy. And that's my Uncle Gerald right there, my father's brother. But they were so young and healthy, and I thought that was a good photograph. This is a picture of my father at the Democratic Convention. Can you see, David? Democratic Convention in 1972, 6 weeks after he was injured. And how he was able to make this speech 6 weeks after he'd been shot 5 times, I'll never know. But the courage and determination to make it was there. And he told this convention, he said, if you nominate this platform, this party will lose by the largest majority in the history of the Democratic Party, which is exactly what happened. George McGovern used to call my dad every day. He was a nominee that year. And he said, George, if you'll just endorse me, which Dad couldn't do, he said, George, this platform goes against everything that I fought and suffered for. My father was a Democrat, but it was too liberal for him. McGovern said, if you'll just let me come have my picture made with you. And he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't. He felt as though he would have forsaken all that he had advocated and articulated. This is a picture in 1971 of Dad working out a year before he was shot on the speed bag at the mansion. I found that. I thought that was an interesting picture. He was a Golden Gloves champion twice, and he was captain of the University of Alabama boxing team. This is just a classic picture I found of him in 1972, the classic Wallace Fire and Brimstone. This is a picture of Mother that someone sent me from, this was at the Blessing of the Fleet in Bayou La Batterie, probably 1965, and I just thought that was, she loved the outdoors, and she loved to fish and hunt, and was a tomboy of sorts. I've run into people occasionally who went to high school with her, and she had tomboy ways. This is an interesting photograph. This is a photograph of my father reading the 23rd Psalm the day he leaves Holy Cross Hospital on his way back to land in Montgomery, on his way to Miami. And it was a very emotional moment for him because he'd been so close to death at Holy Cross Hospital, not only from the gunshot wounds, but from the complications those wounds caused relative to peritonitis and abscesses and so on. So he'd been near to death many times. Ethel Kennedy visited him in the hospital, Robert Kennedy's widow, and that's a great photograph. But he was visited in the hospital by Shirley Chisholm and George McGovern, Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, and many others. Some of the demonstrators in Gary, Indiana, Wallace not welcome, Wallace go home. We always had demonstrators. This is a picture in January of 1987, the day he leaves office as governor after serving his fourth term, and I'm taking office as treasurer. He's swearing me in. An interesting aside about this, I had written out the oath, which he'd given many times in his life, and I'd written it out with commas of where to pause. And I never did discuss it with him. I just said, I've got commas where to pause. He didn't pause. He did not pause. I think he did that in 2 takes. And if you look at me, I'm looking at him with such intensity, thinking to myself, gosh, I hope I can remember everything he just said. But I was able to get it out. And the Bible, that's the Bible that Mother gave me. And then that's my children's Bible there. January of 87, a long time ago. This is a picture of Dad and his friend Glenn Curley in University of Alabama as law students, downtown Tuscaloosa. This is a picture in Clayton of Rebecca Beasley, Senator Billy Beasley's wife, and our dear friend. We had a signing in Clayton a few weeks ago, had a big crowd, but every year they have almost every year, a play they call Wallace the Clayton Years. And
tell them to go. It's worth it.
What now?
You tell them to go.
It's good, isn't it, Mike? Yeah. It's and actually the last time they had it, I helped rewrite a lot of the dialogue and actually wrote some of the music they use in the play. But interesting story about Rebecca's mother, Bertie Parrish. Dad was on one of the programs, mid-60s, Meet the Press, Face the Nation. And they had become increasingly frustrated with their inability to keep up with him, and they came to realize that he was a constitutional scholar and well-read. He read deeply and widely on a number of subjects. And one of the interviewers Anthony Lewis, I think, became so frustrated. He said, well, Governor, what do you read to keep up with international affairs? And Dad said, I read the Clayton Record by Miss Bertie Parrish. What do you read, Mr. Lewis? The Clayton Record is 4 or 5 or 6 pages, and it has community news, and it's a column down the left side where the Greens visited the Hartzogs in Louisville last week, and when the hummingbirds are coming in. So the next day, there was a call from the Kremlin in Moscow about getting a subscription to the paper. This is a picture of my sisters, Lee and Bobby and Peggy, and at Rebecca and Senator Beasley's home after the play one night. And my dear friend Alva Lambert plays my father in the play, and he does a wonderful job. Oh, this is the same picture again. Oh, yeah, this is a picture of Dad in the church. I named this picture Brothers in Christ, Amen. It's a wonderful photograph. This is an interesting story behind this picture. This is my father's mother, Moselle. And my father was shot in May of 72, and Moselle had just gone in the hospital for brain surgery, had a tumor, benign tumor. So they kept the fact from her that he had been injured for about 2 weeks until she was recovering, and so they could tell her. This is the first time she'd seen him since he'd been shot, so I entitled that A Mother and Child Reunion. Wonderful photograph. 1958 photograph, famous flatbed. You look so much younger there, you can tell, but that's one of the rallies, the way we used to have them. 5, 6, 7 rallies a day with Minnie Pearl. Now it's so much social media and TV and radio, and I understand that, but if something won, maybe there's something lost as well. This is my father's first visit to the Capitol after his injury. You can tell he's a good bit thinner, but it's a wonderful photograph, I think. A picture of my family, Elizabeth, and Courtney, Leslie, and Corey and Robbie. This is Elizabeth and me at Courtney's wedding in Birmingham, 2008. Wow, that is correct, isn't it? 2008 one was good. This is a picture in 1994 of my two sons visiting with my dad at his home. Yep. It's really interesting over the years. You'd visit him at home, and you had to break your way through the cigar smoke to get to him, you know. But cigar smoke, but he. That's a great photograph. This is me in 1958 holding a guitar with Curly and the band on the back of a flat. I think that's the first guitar I ever held. Yeah. This is a postcard I found of Mother that was out for a while. It's really interesting about the what she wore in 1966 when she ran for governor. It was a uniform, really. You see the white with the great seal and the half turtleneck and then the skirt. She had different colors, and it was feminine enough, I thought, but it was like a uniform as well. It looked dignified as well. This is my father in 1964 being briefed by the military on Vietnam. He either looks like a movie star or one of the Sopranos one. I'm not sure what she looks like. And this is as he's preparing for Meet the Press, setting his watch. This is blooding the nose of his two-lane opponent. He loved this picture, but his mother didn't like it at all. But off of his bedroom on Hillwood where he lived, he had that blown up and big, and he loved that picture. He was written up as a boxer. He's captain of the boxing team by the Nashville Tennessean as the hardest hitting little man in the South. He was had quite a punch. Could have been a professional boxer, but this is Mother's inaugural, my dad's inaugural ball in 1963, and this gown was made by Mary Jo Ventris, Mother's dearest friend, and that's Oscar Harper on the right, old friend of ours. A wonderful moment. This is a prayer breakfast the morning of Mother's inauguration that I thought was a great photograph. This is my dad's retirement
House chamber.
speech. Wasn't it?
House chamber, old house chamber.
Yeah, old house chamber, Mike. And I've climbed my last political mountain, but I still have some personal hills I must climb. But little known to a lot of people, he had two speeches that day. And he was always the master of the element of surprise of what he was going to do politically. But I had been visiting with him as I would so often, and the more I heard him discuss the possibility of running for a fifth term, the more I realized he was not going to run. He would talk about how he couldn't give a full measure of himself. He'd been to the hospital several times. His energy level wasn't what it could have been, and he knew that, and he didn't think it was fair to the people of Alabama because of that. So he did the right thing, I think. I believe he did. Elvis Presley. Elvis was a big fan. Very few people know this. I've written about this, but Elvis used to call my father all the time, even before he was injured. But after he was injured, Elvis would call him and offer him his various vacation places around the world. And he would say, I'll have my jet pick you up and I'll come if you like and we'll go. And he'd say things like, us Southern boys need to stick together, you know, Elvis being from Mississippi. And Elvis was wonderful to him. He just loved him. I remember he said he had a Wallace for President sign on the front lawn of Graceland in '68. I don't know if he did, but he told him he did. But I walked.
Made out the Coliseum out there last time Elvis.
Just a few months before he died, Mike, 77. But I walked in Dad's bedroom one night at the mansion, and he was on the phone, kind of late at night, and he was on the phone, and he kind of rolled his eyes, and I said, "Who is it?" He said, "It's Elvis Presley." He put his hand on the receiver. I said, "Oh, that's good." He said, "No, I can't get him off the phone." And I thought, only everybody's trying to get him on the phone. You can't get him off the phone. But there's Elvin Stanton back there in the back, one of Dad's great assistants and wonderful man. Air Force shot of Dad on the right. He was an engineer on a B-29 bomber. They flew night missions over Japan. And interesting story about the bombing crew. The name of their plane was A Sentimental Journey. Dad already had a law degree. He'd gone in to be a pilot, but he came down with spinal meningitis that nearly killed him, so it washed him out of pilot training. But he had enough flight experience to fly a plane. So when they would be having R&R on the beach on the island of Tinian in between missions, which were 18-hour missions over Japan from the island of Tinian, long missions, the guys on the beach would turn and say, "Where's George C.?" And one of the guys say, "He's in the cockpit going over everything to make sure he can get us home." Because had the pilots been shot, the engineer sat right behind the pilots with his back, keeping all the fuel gauges, and Dad would have just sat there and tried to get them home. He was always thinking. This is a great photograph. I found this a few years ago in 1970, 71, and I just came across it and I thought, wow, I'd follow those three guys into battle. And Bear Bryant's wife, Mary Harmon, was a huge fan of my father. She would tell anybody. My dad used to try to quieten her down a little bit. He'd say to Mary Harmon, "Not everybody's for me in Alabama. Not everybody likes me in Alabama." She said, "I don't care, George C., I'm for you." So she would, and he was a great fan and friend of Shug Jordan. What a great man he was and coach. That's Elizabeth on the left and Mother's dear friend Mary Jo Ventris. And the brooches they're wearing were brooches of Mother's that Mother had given to Mary Jo, and Mary Jo gave you that. Is that correct, honey? Okay. And that's a great photograph. This is day of Dad's funeral, part of it, and the official state funeral. This is his burial vault emblazoned with a great seal. I didn't know if many people had ever seen that. Great, wonderful meeting with Pope John Paul II in 1984 on a European industrial hunting trip, recruiting trip during my father's last term. I think my father thought they were going to meet with the Pope with another delegation with several people, and it would be a few minutes. As it happened, they met alone with the Pope for about 45 minutes. A lot of ironies about this photograph. My father was shot in 1982 by a man who shot him 5 times. The Pope was shot in 1981 by a man who shot him 4 times. Several other people were injured in the shootings. Both of these men forgave the men who shot them and reached out to them in love and forgiveness. They were both advocates for the average worker and for the poor, and advocates for the poor. A lot of similarities. But that was a very, very special meeting for my father, and he talked about it until the day he died. 2 spirits embracing there, really. One of the crowd shots from 1972. He could pack them in. This is a picture of Mother during her term as governor, and she's reviewing the National Guard troops, as governors do. And, of course, she's governor at the time, and as the rumor has it, she was kissed more by a National Guardsman than any governor in Alabama's history. This is a picture of Dad at the University of Alabama. That's one of his boxing buddies here, but that Wallace stare, I guess. I thought that was an interesting picture, but life was tough. He had to work 2 or 3 jobs at once, go to school, never owned any law school books. He had to borrow the books and read rapidly. But life was a fight and struggle from the time he was small, all of his life, really. There's a Senate page when he was 15, one of his service photographs. He was a sergeant. One of his boxing buddies, you can tell here he's got a mouse right there from his latest match. Another picture of Mother at her prayer breakfast. This picture is the famous turkey picture I know everyone's seen. I bet I've had 200 people tell me they were in the woods with her the morning she shot that turkey. And anybody who turkey hunts knows it's difficult enough by yourself to have 200 people. And I just always say, I know you were there. I realize you were right there with her. This is a picture of the day Mother announced for governor, and it's me and Bobby and Dad and Peggy and Lee with her tongue out there, and Mother. This is the day I signed my contract with MGM Records in 1973. Dad had actually been shot a few months before that. This is our home in Clayton, on Eufaula Avenue. Miriam, you remember that home? Well, I know you do. But in many, many ways, I know that the most peaceful and tranquil days of our lives were the lives in our days in Clayton, and I've written extensively about Clayton. Because really, as I think about it, when my father became governor, it was not a gradual rise in terms of his ambitions where they took him. It was like meteoric, a supernova across the political universe I've written. It all happened so quickly for him. Mother's inaugural parade, January of 1967. I guess is that it? End of it? This is a picture of Dad, Mother, and Jack Benny. Most of you know Jack Benny. Interesting story. I was talking to a young fellow, Andrew Remington, who's the son of some friends of ours. I think Andrew's 27. And I told him, I said, Andrew, I have a picture of my dad, mother, and Jack Benny in the book. You know what he asked me? Who's Jack Benny? But I remember Jack Benny. I have a picture of Mother and Bob Hope, too. I've got to find. This is my father and John Kennedy. A few months before President Kennedy was shot, Dad flew with the president from Mobile to Huntsville on Air Force One. And they had a little exchange, very respectful. My father was very respectful of the president, but they had a disagreement on the plane and about a public policy matter. And the congressman on the plane, Bill Nichols and others, said there was tension in the air after that exchange. John Kennedy Jr., who came to interview Dad in 1997 for the first edition of George magazine. And John Jr. wrote me a long handwritten letter really asking my permission to come interview my father because his family had been through so much, people trying to take advantage. And he assured me that his mission was simply to allow my father to tell his story and talk about the national efforts and so on. And we got to know each other and had a lot in common. I was in Zimbabwe. I'd landed in Zimbabwe for a 2-week hunt the day his plane was missing. And we got back 2 weeks later and it was out of the news. But I remember receiving a call from my office. I was on the Public Service Commission and writing in one of the most remote parts of Africa about a man I've considered my friend because we spent some nice times together. But what a loss, what a tragedy. Okay, that's it. And thank you, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Is that where we are, Sherry?
Yes, we have about 5 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, and Shay or I will give you a microphone to speak into. Please speak into the microphone so that it can be recorded. Thank you. We have them right here.
All right, Mr. Wallace. We're about the same age. We were in high school about the same time. My recollection serves, your name of your musical, you are a bona fide recording artist that you showed us. The name of your group was George Wallace Jr. and the Governors.
Governors Four.
Can you share a few experiences, perhaps they're all humorous, from your recording day?
I can't share them all. No, I can't share all of them. But, I had fun with the group. I love music. I still record. I was with MGM for a couple of years as a writer and an artist, and still record down in Palmetto, Florida with some friends who have a great studio. But I was able to travel with my friend Hank Williams Jr. on 2 of his tours. We got to be great friends. We found that being, I think, juniors of famous cultural icons brought us together, and we spent a lot of time in the bus playing and music and enjoying each other's company. He gravitated to me because I think we had so much in common. But I love music. I still love to write and record, and I still do that. But we had some wonderful times. They were very similar to a political. You go play, and then you meet the people after it's over. And a lot of similarities between that and political. But we had records that did very well. Missing You was a song that did well all over Alabama and across the region and even Pennsylvania. When I was with MGM, we had a song called Why Don't They Understand that was a pick hit in Billboard magazine, and I was very proud of that. what I realized over time was that I think my love is greater than my ability, so I went back to college, but I still enjoy playing. And my son Robbie is an excellent guitar player. He's very, very good, but I still enjoy playing. Thank you for asking. I think that's really my first love, music, truly.
George, I've got one. I had the good fortune to work with your dad. My dad did too.
I know, Brian.
I carried an officer in from the reserves one day, and your dad did. He said, "Oh, I see. I was a captain of the guard, and this is Lieutenant Colonel." He said, "They offered me the chance to become an officer, but there's a lot more sergeants that vote now."
That's exactly right.
Excuse me, I think that we have run out of time for questions, but our speaker will be here after the program. He will sign your book, or you may have more questions for him. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
For sharing.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you very much. See you, Ben.
Very good, very good.